In this video, we're going to transform this to make the whole sound into this. Hi, I'm Joe and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, please consider subscribing below. This is a whole series of videos, so if you also hit the bell icon below, you'll be notified when the next one comes out. In this series, we're learning 2 chords per video. In this case, it's the C major and G major chord. I provided a little bit more of a background to the video series in the first video, and there's also a second video. I'll put a link to them in the description below. The main idea behind the video is pretty much this. I'll introduce you to 2 chords. These are a combination of chords that are often used in a song progression, so you can learn to practice to switch between them. And I broke down this video into 4 parts. In the first part, I'll introduce you to the chord shapes of the C and G major chord. Then you'll hear those chords used in a specific song that I put together for you that you can also practice at home. 3, I'll break down each individual song part that I'm playing on the guitar so you can see exactly what I'm doing. And 4th, I'll give you some practice tips. Let's get started. Before we listen to the song that I put together for this lesson, I'm going to show you a couple of the fingerings that we're going to be using for the 2 new chords that you're going to learn, which is the C and the G chord. Hopefully you watched the first video in this series, and if you didn't, please refer to the link down below in the description so you can understand how I'm going to be talking about the neck of the guitar and fingering these chords so you can learn them. The first chord up is the C chord. Now the C chords are going to start this way. We're going to use the A string, but put our 3rd finger on the 3rd fret of the A string. That is a C note, and that's going to be the root of this chord. Next, we're going to put our 2nd finger on the 2nd fret of the D string. Then we're going to have an open G string. And then our 1st finger is going to go on the 1st fret of the B string, which is also a C. So you have 2 roots in this chord. And what's nice about this chord here is you can strum from the 5th string down to make the whole sound. Now, let's move to the G chord. There's several ways to play a G chord. Most people will teach you to play the G chord this way, which is your 2nd finger on the 3rd fret of the low E string, your 1st finger on the 2nd fret of the A string, then you have a set of open strings, which is your D, G, and B, and then your 3rd finger will go on the high E string on the 3rd fret. So all in all, the chord sounds like this. Another alternative to play this chord is to take your 3rd finger and just move it up 1 string. So now it's on the 3rd fret of the B string, and you put your pinky behind that where your 3rd finger was on the high E string to have this G chord. A lot of the pros also will eliminate the 3rd in the chord, which happens to be the B that's underneath your 1st finger, and they slightly bend their 2nd finger down to mute the A string. They can also play a G chord like this. Now, if we recall where we came from the C chord, and to help switching in between chords, I'm going to show you another fingering. So, here was the C chord again. If you take the top 2 fingers and simply move them closer to you, and put your 3rd finger now on the 3rd fret of the E string, and your 2nd finger behind that on the 2nd fret of the A string, again keep everything else open, and put your pinky down on the high E string for the G note, you now have another G chord. You shouldn't get too married to the fingerings that you're learning. You can always finger things multiple ways on a guitar, and it's important to do that because in certain ways, this is more efficient for me to go from the C chord over to the G chord, and that's why I'm showing you this fingering. So I encourage you to experiment with different fingerings because it's going to open up some different opportunities for you later on. Enough about that. Let's move to the track, and then I'll break down each guitar part for you so you can learn exactly what I'm playing. There's 3 parts to this song, and what's nice, all the parts are going to stay in the first position here. So the same exact shapes that you learned previously in this video, you're going to be applying them to all 3 parts. Let's take a look at the first part. The first part consists of the C and G chord, obviously, but what we're going to do is introduce something new. In previous videos, you were playing chords with longer note durations. In this case here, we're going to introduce something called the 8th note. Now, what is an 8th note? First of all, the song is in 4/4 time. That means there's 4 beats per measure of music, and the quarter note gets 1 beat value. So a quarter note is counted 1, 2, 3, 4. An 8th note is taking a quarter note and cutting it in half. And we count those a little bit differently. That's going to go like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So the challenge with this part is this. Even though you're using a basic shape up top, you're going to be bouncing your hand on the strings in an 8th note rhythm and trying to keep that as steady as possible. As you notice, we lost the pick for this part, and we're basically going to be playing 8th notes kind of in a bouncy feel, but as steady as possible. So the part's going to go like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and over to the G chord. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. It looks very simple, but I'm going to tell you it's very tricky to keep all of that even and steady. For the second part, we're going to use a pick, and I chose this part for a very specific reason. Lots of times when you're practicing chords, you have to make sure that each note is ringing out individually and true. If it's not, usually 2 things are happening. You're not pressing down hard enough, and you're kind of getting a dead sound, or your fingers are arched over and it's hitting a note below it, and deadening the string. So, this part is basically an arpeggiated part, which means we're going to play each individual note individually in the chord. Instead of playing a full chord like this, we're going to play each part individually. And again, I gave you this part for a very specific reason, to make sure that you're practicing having a nice, clean sound for each individual note inside of your chord. This part is quarter notes now, so you'll play 1 string for each beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Going to the G chord, same thing. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then back to the C chord. Finally, let's look at the third part. The third part, again, utilizes this same shape. Now, I gave it to you for a specific reason, because I wanted you to start thinking about looking at these chord shapes not just as one big block, but you can start to take them apart and only use certain parts of a chord shape. And why would you do that? Well, most of the time, the band is already playing the root note. You have either a bass player playing that, or there might be a keyboardist. So that frees you up to play a part that has less notes in it. You don't have to always play full chord shapes all the time. Lots of times you can get away with a very basic part that sits really well in the overall mix of the song. So for this part here, what we're doing is we're taking the C chord and we're removing our top 2 fingers. We're only going to use our first finger on the first fret of the B string. And this part starts backwards, which means we're going to start on the high E string and work back on the chord. And for the G chord, remember we had this shape? Same thing, we're going to remove our top 2 fingers and just use the 3rd finger on the high E string, and again, work backwards through the chord. So the whole part sounds like this for the C chord, to the G chord, So you have your guitar in tune, what do you practice? Well, there's actually a lot to practice in this lesson. You have 2 new chord shapes to learn, the C and the G chord, and if you recall, you actually have multiple fingerings for that G chord. So I would practice all of them. Practice first the C chord, then the G chord, practice switching in between them, and as a bonus challenge for yourself, why don't you practice switching from one C chord to one G chord shape, back to the C chord, back to a different G chord shape. That way your fingers can get used to different combinations of that G chord. The next thing you want to work on is that new rhythm pattern, the 8th note. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and just stick with one chord for now. You can practice plucking it like I was doing with my fingers, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, or practice strumming it. with a downstroke and an upstroke. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and really get that nice and steady. Make sure that each subdivision of the beat has the same duration. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Just practice getting that nice and smooth. I know I'm repeating myself, but make sure you're practicing to a steady beat. Get a metronome, download these tracks for free from my website. Just do something to keep things steady so while you're practicing, you really get your timing down well. And while you're practicing the second and third part, make sure that each note is ringing true. And the last thing, start experimenting now. Put things together in your own unique way and start finding your own individual style that's inside you. That's a wrap on the third video in this series. If you haven't seen the first two, I'll put a link in the description below. And while you're down there, if you don't mind, please consider supporting the channel for free by subscribing down below, hitting the like button, and knock on the bell so you'll be notified when the next video in this series comes out. Until next time. And if you notice, I was playing that part kind of soft. I wasn't banging out. I see your tail.